Good evening, everybody. It is a delight to welcome you all to the Upper House to hear Jan Sienkiewicz's Upper House seminar on Mycenaean Civilisation Reconsidered. Jan is our Richard Bradford McConnell Fellow at the BSA, and as a Bronze Age archaeologist, he has a particular interest in funerary archaeology. He did his PhD with the University of Cambridge, but also in the British Museum as well, working in particular on legacy material from the late Bronze Age cemetery at Ialysos in Rhodes. And one of the things that he's doing here, one of the academic things that he's doing here at the Upper House, is in fact working on the publication of his thesis too. He is recontextualizing the material in order to be able to look at and comment on networks of social interaction and cultural affiliation. Jan is a great sports person and is one of the few people to take up the offer of walking Chewy up the top of Ialysos with me first thing in the morning, which is a bit of a contrast to his other secret love, which is custard-based desserts. I'm not sure I was meant to read that out, but anyway. He's been a wonderful school student, and he has been as bad at making mulled wine as the other school student we've had so far, Eddie, but he has recouped some favour amongst the staff by making excellent gin and soda. So thank you very much for that. And with that, we welcome Jan. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, for this kind of introduction, and I'm glad I redeemed myself with gin and tonic following the disaster that was the mulled wine. Next time, I know to add a whole kilo of sugar to the boxed wine we are handed. Good evening, everyone. It's a great privilege to be given this opportunity to share my research with all of you here at the Upper House seminar. It's also a very exciting moment in one's career to give a lecture from the same platform from which one saw over the years, and by saw, I mean mostly watched on Zoom in my case, many excellent and esteemed academics deliver their presentations. I would like to thank Rebecca and other members of the BSA committee for awarding me the studentship that has enabled me to come here to Athens and to speak to you tonight. I would also like to thank all the school staff that have been involved in the promotion of this event and who are working tonight to facilitate it. And of course, thanks to our donors, to the Friends of the BSA, without whose support, none of this would be possible. With tonight's lecture, I want to present to you a new account of the spread of the so-called Mycenaean culture in the Aegean, and in the process, to question the validity of the very term Mycenaean as a cultural label. If I manage to get the PowerPoint to work. Oh, here we go. The late prehistory of the Aegean region is commonly understood as a story of two successive dominant culture, the Minoan, emanating from Crete, and the Mycenaean, hailing from the southern Greek mainland. According to the established narrative, after the collapse of the Neopalatial civilization on Crete, communities in the wider Aegean region, which up to that point were under evident influence of Cretan societies, undergo the process of Mycenaeanisation. This process, defined by my struggling to pronounce it each time, but also by the appearance and spread of traits and features that are said to have originated on the Greek mainland. These traits and features include, first and foremost, the Helladic style pottery and specific tomb types, chamber and tholos tombs, but also weapon burials, distinct form of jewelry in glass and gold, and standardized terracotta figurines. Since these traits and features often occur together, for example, we might find weapon burials in chamber tomb together with Helladic style pottery, they are often considered to spread as a cultural package and stand for the movement of Mycenaeans out of the Greek mainland or the adoption of the broadly defined Mycenaean culture by communities in the wider Aegean. In this view, what we call an archaeological culture, that is, a set of material culture traits and features that occur within a particular geographical area, in our case, the southern and central Aegean, is equated with actual culture, with ancient people's social and political organization, self-identification, everyday practices, their rituals and beliefs. But what if this equation is actually just a scholarly construct, and the reality of how objects, practices, and identities intersect is much more dynamic than that? This is where my study of the mortuary customs in the islands of the Dodecanese comes into play. Its findings question the validity of that very equation and suggest that we ought to rethink how we approach the study of culture change in the prehistoric Aegean. My aim for tonight is to share the unexpected and exciting, in my opinion, new information coming out of my doctoral research, and to use that information to suggest the following revisions to the way we do and think about what came to be known as Mycenaean archaeology. First, that we should decouple exchange of objects, primarily pottery, from cultural exchange, and view networks of trade in ceramics and networks of social-cultural interaction as separate phenomena that may, but do not always, overlap. Second, that changes in pottery styles are not always a barometer of cultural changes, let alone of changes in people's identities, and that in our analysis, we should prioritize function of ceramics and practices involving those ceramics over their style. And finally, third, that contrary to what the label Mycenaean implies, Crete should be considered on par with mainland Greece in the creation and dissemination of material culture and practices that characterize the Aegean. Yeah, we're making music here. It almost sounded like autotune. Okay, let me know if people online can hear me. Okay. Yes, so dissemination of material culture and practices that characterize the Aegean in the second half of the second millennium BC. That is the period that we know as Late Bronze Age 3. These are the three main points of my talk, and I hope they will become self-evident by the end once I presented and discussed all the evidence. I trust you can see that they are not definitive answers, but suggestions, departure points for what I believe could be a fascinating project of rethinking and rewriting the late prehistory of the Aegean. In other words, I would like this talk to be an invitation to a collective reflection on our disciplinary terminologies, methods, and goals. And as a part of it, I am here to reflect on my own approach and the conclusions that I've drawn from my research. And so I would really appreciate your feedback and questions about what I'm about to present in the Q&A session or afterwards over wine or via email. Now, I will start, as tradition dictates, with the history of scholarship to show how the term Mycenaean has shaped the study of island communities in the Aegean, as well as to situate my research and contextualize my work on the material from the cemetery of Ialysos on Rhodes. Then I will present the history of the Ialysos community and discuss its chamber tomb cemetery in order to highlight this community's long-standing connection to Crete and put into question the cultural link with mainland Greece. The issue of mainland Greek pottery at Ialysos will be tackled through a case study of pottery assemblages on Carpathos and Rhodes, the subject of the next section of my talk, in which I focus on cultural practices and explore further the Cretan connection. Then I will discuss the island of Kos with its chamber and tholos tombs and use this case study as a departure point for zooming out onto different island networks in the southern Aegean, showing how the same practices may have served the construction of different identities. Lastly, I will circle back to the very term Mycenaean and make a case for approaching the past not through imposition of modern scholarly labels, but through a detailed descriptive account of individual communities, the approach that I call the ethnography of the past. We start with chapter 1, Islands and Mycenaean Archaeology. In 1868, Sir Alfred Biliotti, instructed by the British Museum to conduct an archaeological exploration of Ialysos on Rhodes, came across tombs that contained pottery and other items of previously unknown type, which he considered to be archaic. Parallels drawn subsequently between this material and vessels found under tephra layers on Santorini indicated that these objects were of far more remote antiquity. Following Schliemann's uncovering of the shaft graves at Mycenae, when his discoveries were being presented to the Society of Antiquaries of London in 1877, the material from Rhodes was described in reference to the more spectacular finds. Soon after, prehistoric vessels from Rhodes and from another island in the Dodecanese, Kalymnos, were published together with similar pottery found in other parts of the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean under the title Mechanische Vasen. And finally, we find the following statement in the first synthetic account of this newly recognized distinct archaeological culture. While other terms have been proposed, it seems desirable for the present to adhere to that name, which is at once suggested by its earliest known and chief seat, Mycenae. And to the authors and bearers of this civilization throughout Greece, we must apply the same term, Mycenaean. Here, we see how material culture, political organization, and ethnicity got lumped together under an ethic label applied to prehistoric people of unknown identities. This mode of thinking pretty much dominated the discourse of Aegean prehistory for the whole of the 20th century. Mycenaean material culture was considered to denote people from mainland Greece, and so its spread, Mycenaeanisation, got equated with movement of those people in historicizing narratives about colonization, settlement, invasions, and thalassocracies. This view finds its reflection in these two seminal studies. Both concerned primarily with Rhodes, the island which had been described as the most important center of Mycenaean civilization outside of the Greek mainland. Beginning in the 1990s, however, such mode of thinking has come under increased critique, and scholars started to engage systematically with variability and local idiosyncrasies in the use of Mycenaean material culture. As a result, they began viewing the process of Mycenaeanization as brought about by local population throughout the Aegean who adopted the mainland-derived objects and customs. For instance, in her PhD, Sofia Woutsaki interpreted the uptake of chamber tombs on Rhodes and Kos and the use of Helladic-style pottery as acculturation, which was a result of the political domination by the islands by a mainland Greek polity, suggesting Mycenae as the likely candidate. Mercurios Georgiadis, on the other hand, considered the islands of the Southeast Aegean as politically independent, but he saw that changes in funerary customs and material culture, despite their idiosyncratic nature, as an indicator that, quote, the socio-cultural identity of the local societies and peoples is Mycenaean. Both scholars, in their attempts to assess the political status and identity of island populations, compared their tombs, burial practices, and deposited objects to those attested on the Greek mainland. So far, the only somewhat different perspective has been offered by Penelope Mountjoy in her standalone article, in which she presented the following argument. The Mycenaean culture of the East Aegean islands should not be considered in relation to that of the Greek mainland, as has generally been done up until now, but rather in terms of the East Aegean West Anatolian interface, an area which forms an entity between the Mycenaean islands of the Central Aegean and the Anatolian hinterland. This was, and still is, a worthwhile proposition, but I think we can all see a problem here. If this culture is different, a uniquely local amalgamation of different traits and traditions, then why is it still Mycenaean? Actually, from the 1990s onwards, this very term has come under increasing scrutiny in some scholarly circles, with growing awareness that it inadvertently imposes a whole set of assumptions about the source and nature of the Aegean-wide changes in material culture. This awareness was perhaps best articulated by Nisha McSweeney back in 2008. The assumption that the late Bronze Age 3 koine primarily represents mainland culture is largely due to the vagueness of the term Mycenaean and its unspecific use to describe the mainland Greek societies of late Bronze Age 1 to 2 period, as well as a wider Aegean koine in late Bronze Age 3. 15 years on, and we are still struggling to move on from that term and the assumptions it imposes. I do not want to quote individual scholars here because I believe the current state of affairs is a systemic issue brought about by an intellectual inheritance from culture historical and text-based archaeologies, by specific intellectual traditions perpetuated through academic hierarchies and practices, and by inherently interpretative terminologies. But we do need to define the state of affairs, so we can take these two recent edited volumes where we can find the following assertions. Chamber tombs in the islands of the Southeast Aegean follow the shapes and burial practices attested in mainland Greece. They are the preeminent form for Mycenaean burials and the most characteristic aspect of Mycenaean culture. Their use signals the adoption of the Mycenaean identity, which was part of the Mycenaean social and political ideology. Essentially, for the Southeast Aegean, I need to add, we have replaced the pots equal people or tombs equal people paradigm with pots and tombs represent a specific identity. But what if, instead of labeling prehistoric people, instead of trying to define who they were and what they identified as, we simply ask what those people did. What those people did with objects, with tombs, and begin our inquiry there. What if we could go back to the very beginning, to Ialysos, where the story of the Mycenaean archaeology began, and start afresh reconstructing relations between Aegean communities from the bottom up, and see what picture would emerge from that? This was the opportunity I was given with a PhD project that started as a collaboration between the University of Cambridge and the British Museum, set up to re-examine the objects and archival material from Sir Alfred Biliotti's pioneering excavations of Ialysos. My work focused on reconstructing original tomb assemblages, on assigning museum artifacts to their original contexts, which I have managed to do for most ceramics in the collection. As a result, we have a more secure dating of individual tombs, and a comprehensive knowledge of the funerary assemblages, including those from the crucial and hitherto poorly understood first phase of the cemetery's use. In the process, I had identified this recurring pottery set with clear functional association between its components, which suggested that specific practices, in this case, drinking using fineware ceramics, structured funerary deposition of objects at Ialysos. This steered my research towards studying the composition of funerary assemblages with the aim of identifying and mapping out depositional practices and asking what functional or conceptual associations they represent and why. For this purpose, I integrated into a single analysis the evidence from Biliotti's tombs with that from much better documented subsequent excavations carried out by Amadeo Maiuri and Giulio Jacopi. The method that I employed for analyzing Ialysos assemblages, I then applied to other cemeteries in the Dodecanese, creating arguably the most detailed picture of mortuary behavior in that region offered to date. At least this is what the abstract of my thesis says. The identified pottery set, which in a fit of unconstrained imagination I called the standard drinking set, also proved instrumental in developing a refined system of tomb dating and sequencing. In some tombs, including a demonstrably single burial ones, this coherent set included pottery of two succeeding styles. What is more, in a number of those cases, we see the larger storage jars belonging to the older style and pouring and drinking vessels to the newer. This fits perfectly with ethnoarchaeological evidence for vessel use and discard. Larger vessels usually last longer, whilst smaller and more often handled pots get broken and replaced sooner. In other words, thanks to the identification of the drinking set, we have now confirmed tombs dating precisely to the transition between different pottery styles. This allows us to track the development of Ialysos and other cemeteries, and to track the appearance of certain practices with a level of resolution absolutely unique for prehistoric contexts. Okay, I think we've had enough of the background information, and now we can move to the next part of the talk, chapter 2, Ialysos, community and the cemetery. The Ialysos area was settled in the Middle Bronze Age. Earlier evidence for habitation is found only a few kilometers to the west at the site of Asomatos, which was destroyed and abandoned at the end of the early Bronze Age. Already in the Middle Bronze Age, the local material milieu, which is said to exhibit strong continuities with Asomatos, was punctuated by demonstrably non-local elements. Those included the so-called polytheron, an architectural form of Cretan origins, as well as Cretan Kamaras ware pottery and discoid loom weights, which are associated with a weaving technique that spread across the southern Aegean from Crete. The polytheron at Ialysos is the earliest example of this structure found outside of Crete, and one of the earliest known altogether. A fragment of a faience object found in its vicinity, a likely import from the Eastern Mediterranean, helps to explain this Cretan connection. Owing to its strategic location at the gateway to the Aegean, Ialysos must have become involved in maritime traffic that developed at the time between Crete's nascent city-states and Eastern Mediterranean societies, acting as a stopover point en route. In the process, at least some groups at Ialysos seem to have adopted elements of Cretan-derived material culture and practices. But they did so not just as passive consumers. More recent excavations at Ialysos revealed an extraordinary deposit with almost 200 ball tusks and thousands of half-finished precious metal objects. The working of raw materials, presumably for conversion into higher value items, implies active participation of local agents in the creation of the material prestige vocabulary that characterizes the emerging at the time network of Aegean communities under strong Cretan influence. By the beginning of the late Bronze Age, Ialysos developed into what seems to be one of the largest settlements in the southern Aegean. Its material culture displays even stronger affinities with Crete, buildings of ashlar masonry, 3 polythera, the interiors of nearly all houses decorated with frescoes, Cretan religious iconography and objects related to cult. The production of pottery and stone vessels displays also clear Cretan influences, both in terms of shapes and decorations. Most of the imported pottery came from the island of Kos and Crete in the form of transport and storage vessels. What started earlier as a movement of exotica, such as Kamaras ware, developed now into more systematic bulk exchange of consumables, although fine ware imports continued to arrive. At first glance, this picture continues into the late Bronze Age too, at least as far as the pottery is concerned, which is our main source of knowledge about this phase of the settlement. The household assemblages continue to represent what we should now consider local ceramic assemblages, which included many Cretan-derived shapes such as conical cups and oval mouth amphora. By saying local, I mean that what once were foreign elements became now fully absorbed into local material and cultural milieu. This created a shared habitus with other South Aegean communities that had undergone similar changes, and that includes communities in Crete as well. Fineware imports in the form of decorated containers and tableware, drinking and pouring shapes, also look like quintessential Cretan marine-style or palace-style pieces. However, scientific analysis revealed that they were of mainland Greek manufacture, coming predominantly from the Argolid. Okay, what should we make of this change? Let us take a moment to understand how the Ialysos evidence fits into a bigger picture of pottery production and exchange in the Aegean. Around the late Bronze Age II period, when we believe much of Crete becomes politically unified under the rule of Knossos, pottery workshops of mainland Greece began systematically manufacturing and exporting close imitations of Cnossian fineware ceramics, vessels of the so-called pseudo-Minoan style. This was an intensification of an earlier process of imitation and adoption of Cretan shapes and decorative schemes by potters working in the centers of the southern Greek mainland. Indeed, already before late Bronze Age II, occasional mainland products, such as this imitation of a Cnossian rippled pattern Vafio cup, made their way to communities like Ialysos. The fact is, Crete was never a major exporter of its decorated ceramics, despite their appeal outside the island. Mainland Greek centers, particularly those in the Argolid, simply responded to the existing demand for Cretan decorated pottery. They established themselves first by imitating desirable Cretan wares and managed to then monopolize the trade in fineware ceramics, becoming their main producers and suppliers. In the process, they gradually developed a more distinctly mainland Helladic style pottery, with mass production leading to standardization, and subsequently that standardized pottery appears across the Aegean and beyond. And this is exactly the change that we see at Ialysos. At the beginning of the late Bronze Age III period, pottery of the late Helladic 2B and 3A1 styles appears in the settlement and in the first chamber tombs that were constructed at the time southwest of the settlement. Now, should we associate this change in style of imported pottery with the foundation of chamber tomb cemetery at Ialysos? First of all, I think this is precisely what it is, a change of style. In terms of shapes, the Helladic style imports represent the same range of functionalities as the earlier Minoan style, but mainland produced vessels, containers, and tableware. In other words, there is nothing to suggest that the change in style brings with it any change in practices. Second, although we lack published quantitative data, it does seem that the number of mainland imports grew, indicating more frequent interaction. But it grew out of culturally embedded demand for Cnossian and more generally Cretan fineware vessels in the first place. Third, it is important to note that as Ialysos began receiving Helladic-style imports, the material culture of its settlement exhibit continuities with the previous phases, in terms of either fresco iconography and style or household pottery assemblages. Lastly, by the time first chamber tombs were being constructed at Ialysos, the use of this tomb type was well established at Knossos and began appearing across Crete. So if we want to seek the source of change in local mortuary customs, we ought to contextualize these changes not only within networks of pottery trade, but also within networks of cultural affiliation, and by that I mean the long-standing connection between Ialysos and Crete. Let us then re-examine the claim that tombs at Ialysos, quote, follow the shapes and burial practices attested in mainland Greece. The first tombs that appear at this community, and all subsequently constructed ones, display the canonical layout in terms of having an open passageway, dromos, that leads to a hollowed-out chamber through a narrow doorway, stomion, in which a dry blocking wall was often constructed to seal off the chamber. One of the earliest, if not the earliest tomb constructed at Ialysos, tomb 36, had, however, an unusual feature, namely a stepped dromos. This feature was then replicated in a number of tombs, including one of the largest ones in the cemetery, the Biliotti tomb number 2. The concentration of the stepped dromoi at Ialysos is exceptional for the contemporary cemeteries in the Aegean, and this feature is said to be rare on the Greek mainland. We find it, however, in some of the earliest chamber tombs around Knossos and later in another Cretan site, Armeni. This is far from conclusive, but it highlights that architecturally, the link with the Greek mainland is not the only possible one. Stronger evidence, though, in my opinion, is provided by burial practices. The characteristic element of chamber tomb use on the Greek mainland is that they received many burials, with averages usually between 7 and 9 individuals per chamber. The second defining practice is the so-called secondary burial, a rite in which inhumed bodies were disarticulated and manipulated after their initial deposition. Now, it has long been recognized that at Ialysos, tombs received many fewer inhumations per chamber, mostly between 2 and 3. This is unusual by mainland standards, but these numbers would be very much at home on Crete, which suggests greater similarity in the type of social units represented through burial. My close reading of the published excavation reports and notes from the Italian excavations of Ialysos, since Biliotti did not record any skeletal information, reveal that there were very few cases of unambiguous non-functional manipulation of human remains. By non-functional, I mean that the manipulation was not conducted to make room for more depositions in a limited space of a burial chamber. If anything, we see a certain reluctance to engage with any so-called secondary treatment, and many bodies, even in multiple burial chambers, were left in an extended position, and they had been as they had been inhumed, articulated, and intact. Again, this appears anomalous if we compare it to the mainland cemeteries. Actually, the best parallels for this type of behavior comes from chamber tombs around Knossos once again, from contexts where bodies were not placed in local clay coffins, the so-called larnakes. Speaking of larnakes, one of the often overlooked piece of evidence is this much disturbed shaft grave from Ialysos, the date of which cannot be established, but which originally held a larnax, the quintessential element of Cretan mortuary customs. A shaft grave with a burial in a larnax is attested, as far as I know, but I'm happy to be corrected, in only one other place in the Aegean, and that is the Zafir Papura cemetery at Knossos. Okay, so far, what I'm trying to say is that if we employ the classic parallel-seeking approach and take into account the long-standing connection to Crete, the chamber tombs and burial practices attested at Ialysos do not seem to follow mainland examples in any very evident way. For some, however, what is indicative of the origins of chamber tombs at Ialysos are the objects deposited in them. So let us discuss this aspect next. In the earliest tombs at this cemetery, we find the standard drinking set I introduced earlier. In every context where a stemmed drinking cup, kylix, is found together with a jug, we also see a piriform jar. This is true both for more fragmentary assemblages of the late Bronze Age 3A1 phase and the more completely preserved ones dating to 3A1 and 3A2 transition. In those transitional tombs, this set is ubiquitous and it accompanies weapon burials. The same correlation that kylixes and jugs, when occurring together, are found with piriform jars is also true for the contemporary warrior graves at Knossos, a site which Ialysos shows greater similarities with than with most other cemeteries elsewhere in the Aegean. Granted, the vast majority of pottery deposited in the Ialysos tombs constitute Helladic-style imports from mainland Greece. However, 3 points need to be made about that. First, if we go back to one of the earliest tombs in the cemetery, Tomb 37, which neighbored Tomb 36 with a stepped dromos, its drinking set included a Minoan-style jug and a strainer, which has its best parallels in East Crete. Minoan-style vessels are also found in tombs of the 3A1, 3A2 transition. So we see mixing of pottery with overall share of styles simply reflecting the reality that most fineware ceramics at Ialysos, aka vessels preferred for funerary deposition, over less fine, less intricately decorated, and less valuable products, were supplied from mainland Greece. Second point is that objects deposited in the early phases of the Ialysos cemetery included highly personal items of likely Cretan provenance, items like Cretan-style seals, and swords of Sanders types C and D, the production of which has been attributed to Knossian workshops. Third, that outside of pottery, which in terms of size and quantity is the most prominent element of the tomb assemblages, other standard but potentially valuable offerings do not have obvious mainland links. Take glass jewelry, for instance. By the late Bronze Age 3A2 phase, it's found in 70% of tombs at Ialysos and frequently in large quantities, which makes it the second most ubiquitous object after pottery. Some glass jewelry was produced locally at Ialysos already in the 3A1 phase, as attested by the discovery of a mold for producing was lily and papyrus-shaped beads, and it is the latter shape that we find subsequently in the cemetery. Other shapes may have been also locally produced or could have come from any other Aegean center, including the coast of Anatolia, where such jewelry was also manufactured. And spearheads, the most ubiquitous weapon type found in Ialysos cemetery, were produced locally from late Bronze Age 1 period onwards, given molds and actual spearheads recovered from the settlement. So overall, pottery is only part of the picture, and my argument is that whatever seems on the surface as material culture package is actually a bricolage, a reflection of the local material realities, albeit filtered through choices of what was appropriate for funerary ceremony. On this point, let us slowly begin zooming out of Ialysos to consider how different pottery may be used in the same cultural practices, which brings us to Chapter 3, Rhodes and Carpathos, Communities of Practice. At the 3A1, 3A2 transition at Ialysos, the funerary assemblages began featuring these two uniquely Rhodian shapes, perforated pots and the so-called basket vases. These vessels become subsequently a relatively ubiquitous offering, with perforated pots found in 1/3 of all 28 tombs dated exclusively to the late Bronze Age 3A2 phase. Neither shape has been identified in the associated settlement, as far as I know, and is shown in publications. And so it has been hypothesized that they had primarily funerary function. As chamber tomb use spread from Ialysos to other communities on Rhodes, the inclusion of these two vessels became a relatively common practice on the island. Here we see, for instance, the assemblage from tomb at Maritze, southwest of Ialysos, where our standard drinking set was deposited alongside with a perforated pot. The 3A2 phase at Ialysos also witnessed the appearance of a vessel type previously not found either in the cemetery or the settlement, the large decorated mixing bowl known as a crater. Craters are communal feasting vessels par excellence, and they are found in this phase exclusively alongside standard drinking set, forming what I have, again, very imaginatively termed the extended drinking set. This set is relatively rare and connected to more prominent groups, judging by its inclusion in larger and more richly furnished tombs, and in most cases, it accompanied weapon burials. We find such tombs at Pilone on the east coast of Rhodes, where two funerary assemblages included the extended drinking set, weapons, perforated pots, and basket vases. This material culture complex is remarkably specific and bespeaks close relations between prominent groups in these two Rhodian communities. There is no doubt that in this case we are talking about shared culture, or at least cultural practices, the same drinking set associated with individuals represented as warriors at death, accompanied also by specific vessels of likely funerary function, and buried in the same type of tomb. Now, what I find truly extraordinary, at least I found it as I discovered it, is that we see the same connection between Ialysos and its sister community on Carpathos, Kiadia, a harbor settlement facing in the direction of Rhodes. Pihadia's small chamber tomb cemetery, Makeli, produced extended drinking sets in association with weapon burials, as well as basket vases and a perforated pot. Similar assemblage, albeit without weapons, comes from Alcácer Vonius, where it was found alongside several burials, including one placed in a larnax. This brings me to the point about pottery styles and practices. The extended pottery sets on Carpathos were made up of Cretan Minoan-style ceramics. the same drinking practice, and in the case of Piradia, the same association with individuals buried with weapons, the same funerary vessels, yet different pottery styles. This, in my opinion, undermines the argument that the style of or provenance of pottery found in tombs on roads is indicative of some special cultural link with the mainland. Now, given the geographical proximity and historically close relations between Carpathos and Crete, there is absolutely no reason to suggest the use of chamber tombs in this particular island came from mainland Greece. Indeed, aside from the pottery connection, chamber tombs at Piradia and Alcázar are circular in shape, just like this geographically closest example from East Crete, and the weaponry and bronzes found at Piradia are said to have their best parallels on Crete, not to mention also the Larnax burial from Archaeologically. So if communities on Carpathos, even into the late Bronze Age 3, continued to be influenced by or develop in constant cultural exchange with Cretan societies, as they had done in earlier periods, then should we not consider the same thing to be the case for roads? In fact, there is more to this Cretan connection. Chamber tomb use on Carpathos seems to be a relatively short-lived phenomenon, which lasted only until the beginning of the late Bronze Age 3B period. My refined dating of tombs of Ialysos strongly suggests that this cemetery was abandoned at the beginning of the 3B period, at the time when chamber tomb use across roads declines markedly too. There are two relevant events that correlate with this sudden change. The first is the seemingly final destruction of the settlement of Ialysos, which would explain the hiatus in burial activity at this cemetery, but would not fully account for what happened elsewhere on roads, not to mention the abandonment of chamber tomb use on Carpathos. The second event is the destruction of the Palace of Knossos, the seat of the polity which can be described as the cultural and cosmological center of the Southern Aegean for the late Bronze Age 1 and 2 periods, and is increasingly recognized as such for late Bronze Age 3A1 and 3A2. I'm not saying these two events are correlated or privilege one over the other, but this pattern is highly suggestive, and one cannot help but think that these events and the decline in chamber tomb use in the Southern Dodecanese must be somewhat connected. What is more telling, however, is that this decline happens in the period when the mainland Greek centers are, for the first time in the history of the Southern Aegean, the main players on the regional scene. So how come that the mortuary custom that is considered to be the hallmark of mainland Greek culture declines in popularity in that very period? I would leave this question open and for now move on to another harbor settlement with another chamber tomb cemetery, Seraia on Kos. The assemblages from Seraia's chamber tomb cemetery, Aleona Langada, differ from those on Rhodes and Carpathos by a greater share of locally manufactured vessels, as illustrated, for instance, by the pottery from Aleona tomb 18. In comparison, especially to Ialysos, these tombs contained many fewer valuable items, and the overall object assemblages are much smaller and less standardized, with no recurring distinct sets as we see on Rhodes. An exception to this, however, is Langada tomb 51, which grants us interesting insights into Southeast Aegean networks of interaction and exchange. This tomb dates to late Bronze Age 3A2 period. Here we see the first and only standard drinking set of the type found on contemporary Rhodes and a rhyton. The vessel included in numerous tombs on Rhodes, but this is the only example found to date on Kos. What is interesting is that the large piriform jar seems to be the product of a South Rhodian workshop, bearing the trademark cross-hatchet triangle decoration. I believe this assemblage may indicate that the drinking practices represented by the set and the rhyton came to Seraia via, if not directly, from Rhodes. The deposition of local imitations of Helladic-style vessels in the tombs of Aleona Langada and the dearth of exotica items at the time when Ialysos was receiving both mainland imports and Eastern Mediterranean glass in abundance suggests that social groups at Sarajevo did not have direct access to the same trade networks. Perhaps the mainland ceramics that we see in the tombs of Aleona Langeda arrived there through roads, with the island acting as an intermediary in the movement of those ceramics. That commercial link, confirmed by the presence of Koine pottery in the Ialysos settlement, was not, however, accompanied by the type of cultural convergence that we saw between social groups at Ialysos and Pihavia. And speaking of social groups and cultural practices, what is interesting is the absence of craters in the cemetery of Aleona Langeda. Meanwhile, the components of the extended drinking set, together with arrowheads, come from a disturbed Tholos tomb at Sarajevo. This and another Tholos tomb in the same settlement are the only two examples of this tomb type in the Dodecanese. They stand out in terms of not only their architecture, which by the Southeast Aegean standards can be considered monumental, but also by having gold jewelry deposited in them, which is altogether absent from the contemporary graves of Aleona Langeda. The presence of the crater and weaponry in this indisputably elite context echoes associations that we saw on Carpathos and on Rhodes, but here, this object complex serves to express a much more exclusive identity. In fact, these Tholos tombs, burials, unique for the Dodecanese, tie the Koine elite to a network of Tholos-using groups that stretches from the coast of mainland Greece to the coast of Anatolia, across the central Aegean islands. This network includes sites like Ayatekla on Tinos, where we also see crater-centered drinking set, gold jewelry, and bronzes. But here, given the location of Tinos, which is the westernmost island in this chain, there is little doubt that we are dealing with groups that were connected with the Greek mainland. The emergence of this network in the late Bronze Age 3A2 and its persistence into the 3B period contrasts with the decline of comparatively more egalitarian chamber tomb burials on Carpathos and Rhodes. So here we have different overlapping networks of island groups and communities. By mapping out the deposition of crater-centered drinking sets and weapons, we can observe how this practice involved different tomb types and pottery of different styles and origins, and how it served different local purposes. Those networks are connected differently, and following them leads us to different places, not just mainland Greece. And this is a much more dynamic, more complex, and in my opinion, more interesting picture of cultural changes, which brings us back to the very concept of the Mycenaean culture. So, what do we gain from labeling Aegean island communities of the late Bronze Age 3 period as Mycenaean? I hope that with this talk, so far, I have demonstrated clearly enough that the use of this term has made scholars downplay obvious differences between some of those communities and mainland Greece and overlook their meaningful similarities with Crete. In the process, the diversity of practices between and within those communities, their individual uniqueness, internal dynamics, and external relations have been simplified and flattened out. They have been subsumed within a singular modern cultural label, which assigns all those communities the same identity. Yet, what is not at all, this is not at all what we see in the archaeological record of the Southeast Aegean, which shows meaningful differentiation between social groups within individual communities. My study of the Ialysos cemetery documented a fascinating dynamic where after the cemetery splits into two burial grounds, groups associated with these two parts of the cemetery diverged in their use of chamber tombs. On one burial ground, there was an emphasis on individual burials with weapons. On the other, tombs were used for collective burial and wealth signaling. It was the latter behavior that attracted more social groups, leading to the increased prominence of that burial ground. The practices of those groups subsequently influenced chamber tomb use on Rhodes, shaping the island's idiosyncratic mortuary culture. Remarkably, I documented similar dynamic at Elorna Langada on Kos. There, the shift from one burial ground to another in late Bronze Age 3A2 was associated with a change in the composition of funerary assemblages, which became more standardized, with previously rare drinking vessels becoming a standard offering. What is even more remarkable is that several generations later, at the beginning of late Bronze Age 3B, we witnessed the appearance of gold jewelry and exotica in some tombs and weapons in others, but these object types do not co-occur. This conflict of identities, so to speak, also at this cemetery was followed by an increase in funerary activity relative to its earlier phases. In other words, in two different communities, in two different periods, two modes of representation, wealth and militarism, were constructed in opposition to one another, creating two contrasting identities at death, with wealth signaling creating a pull effect for other social groups. This extraordinary funerary déjà vu raises interesting and pertinent questions about the use of material culture in burial ritual, the relationship between social dynamics and mortuary customs, and the sources of power and prestige. These questions are of relevance not only to Aegean prehistory, but to prehistoric archaeology and material culture studies worldwide. But to answer them, in my opinion, we ought to move past the stale debates revolving around the confusing culture-historical constructs that our own subfield generated and adopt a fresh cross-cultural perspective. We ought to become more anthropologists than historians. We have this incredible rich record with which is totally unique for prehistoric archaeology. I was able to document the fascinating recurrence of the contrasting of weapons and wealth because of the exceptional resolution of the Aegean ceramic chronologies. This holds great potential for exploring the relationship between objects, practices, identities, and culture in a long-term perspective. But to do that well, I believe we need to conduct our studies from the bottom up and look at individual groups and communities in isolation before attempting to link them up by making sense of the similarities and differences in their material culture and practices. My doctoral research, part of which I have presented to you tonight, is just a first step in this direction, in what could be a much bigger project of reconstructing relations between prehistoric Aegean communities and rethinking the nature of the late Bronze Age Aegean koine. I would like to now extend an invitation to this project to anyone who have found my narrative and arguments convincing, or at least thought-provoking, and for those who have not, I would welcome your criticism and questions. Thank you.